Let's move on, though. I've got my panel standing by. Liberal MP Jason Falinski from the Labor Party, Patrick Gorman, both been waiting patiently there. So thank you as ever. We might start with you, Jason.
Good morning, Tom.
Almost taste.
Well, I was going to say, Tom, some more patiently than others.
Yes, well, you've been waiting for Godot there in New South Wales. What do you make of what we've heard from Dominic Perrottet? He's moving things forward. What does this say about health advice, that all along it was just advice and we could pick and choose what we wanted to because that's what elected representatives should be doing?
Yes, that's what it says. I mean, the whole point of electing politicians, electing community leaders, is so that they take the advice, but they also make decisions on the basis of other factors which bureaucrats can't possibly take into account. And that's what he said today, he'll be doing today. And that's frankly what's been going on throughout this pandemic.
Patrick, your thoughts on that? We don't see the WA Chief Health Officer. I suppose you've got the all-powerful Mark McGowan, who will be leader for the next 100 years or so in WA. But is it a fair point from Jason that we have health advice and that's fine, and then leaders need to sort through that, look at that, look at the upsides and downsides and actually make the call rather than just saying health advice and that's the end of it?
Well, I actually believe in policy consistency. I've continued to support the state's rights to make these decisions about what happens in their state and how they manage this virus. I've always said that should be based on health advice, but ultimately it is the New South Wales Premier's decision, whoever that is, from day to day. I believe that that is the way we should run these things. Now, Jason hasn't been consistent on this. He's been happy to give us lectures from New South Wales to WA about how we should handle this pandemic. I'm not going to do that. If this is the decision of the New South Wales government, it's their right to do so.
Well, there's a difference between a right, Patrick Gorman, a right to do it and whether it's a good call. Surely we can still have a view on whether something's a good decision or not, just because someone has a right to do it. The Prime Minister has a right to make all sorts of decisions, but you still criticise them, don't you?
That's my job. I'm a federal parliamentarian. My job is to hold the Prime Minister to account, and there's a lot in that to-do list at the moment. When it comes to the announcement from the New South Wales Premier, I mean, obviously there are some things that I know people in New South Wales have been waiting to hear for a very long time. I haven't lived through that lockdown. I don't want to be giving a lecture from the West to New South Wales. I know how it has felt when we've had people from New South Wales trying to tell us how to live our lives, calling us cave people and other things. So I'm not going to do that. It's the decision for the people of New South Wales. But I am encouraged to hear that children will be able to go back to school in coming weeks. That I know has been really tough for families, really tough for students who are doing important studies. And that's good to hear that there's a path back to return to school.
We're in this position because Gladys Berejiklian, of course, resigned after the announcement that ICAC would be looking into her action. Let me ask you this, Jason Falinski. Did New South Wales voters, or do they still have a right to know whether the Premier knew about possible corruption within her government, how much she knew about it and what she opted to pass on or otherwise?
Tom, I think your question is misdirected. I think what you're trying to ask me is, do the people of New South Wales have a right to privacy any longer? Or is this Stasi-like surveillance system that has been established at the heart of New South Wales politics either appropriate or proper in a modern and liberal democracy, especially when the big issue of this century will be, or one of the big issues, I should say, of this century will be what right any of us have to privacy and our own personal sphere.
All right, that's the answer to your question. What about my question?
Your question is, Tom, predicated on the idea that she did know something. Do you have any evidence that she knew of?
No, I'm asking.
Well, sorry,
but
that's not the way it works. But Tom, that's not the way it works, and it doesn't work that way for a very good reason. Because after 1,000 years of common law, we determined as a civilisation and a culture that people should have the presumption of innocence. And the reason we decided that was that we had tried it the other way round, and the abuse and the destruction on innocent people's lives was too great, and therefore the presumption should lie with each of us, and that we are innocent.
But isn't that only
now, if you want to go,
by this protocol of the Premier standing aside?
Then you establish it. Tom, there are many ways to do it at the moment.
Jason, let me ask this question. that line of guilt before innocence, isn't that
Innocence
only
before
because
guilt,
we now have...
Tom.
Sorry, guilt before innocence. Sorry, I'm used to saying it the other way around. But isn't that only established because we have this custom now that's been established whereby you have to stand down or stand aside if there's an investigation? But if that were not the case, if we said, well, look, that's not working, let's let people stay in their jobs until there's a decision, then there would be no element of guilt before innocence.
Tom, I'm not entirely sure what you're asking, but how I will try to answer that question.
Well, the only reason
by referring you,
she stood down, you know,
because she had no choice. She had no choice. The way that the New South Wales ICAC has been established is that they shoot first and aim later. So at the moment we have the example in Victoria where the Premier of Victoria has been under investigation by their corruption watchdog for 2 years. He doesn't have to step down. He can continue to undertake his role because they have provided him with no evidence that he acted in a corrupt fashion in his negotiations with the fire union. In New South Wales, we have the mere hint of an allegation. No evidence has been presented, no hearing has occurred, and people have to step down.
Do we know that? Have there not been private hearings? Are you saying categorically there have been no
There have been no private hearings, Tom. There have been none.
How do you know that?
There's been no... Well, because someone would have told us by now that there had been private hearings. There has been no private hearings. We are at a public hearing stage. And look, the history of the New South Wales ICAC is clear. You have had dozens of people's lives, innocent people's lives, destroyed, and they have not. And when they have gone to court, each and every time, they've been able to prove that they were not guilty of corruption.
We only have so much time, Patrick. Would you like to talk this, or I know you wanted to talk GST? You get to choose your own adventure here.
I'll go from one to the other. I think let's sum it up as this. Jason and the Liberal political party do not believe in anti-corruption commissions. Labor will establish a federal anti-corruption commission.
Of course they will.
Jason,
of course they will, because in New South Wales we've had a situation where the Carcaneely government was never investigated. Not one time.
That will look at Scott Morrison
very strong. Very strong.
We have no idea. We have no way of... Labor will do it, the Libs won't. Simple as that. When it comes to the GST, what we now
that's not true, talking about telling the truth. Yeah, go on to the GST.
Chill, Jason.
How much more money do you want from the eastern states in WA?
Let me just say on the GST. So
Jason,
what was it? $5.6 billion
GST that you've been trying to steal from us for years and years.
So now we're guilty of
WA awash with money. WA awash with money, Patrick. Let me put that to you.
Take him from the eastern
Doesn't
states.
this show that the extra money you're getting from the GST right now isn't needed?
The principle of the GST reforms was that every state gets 75 cents in the dollar of what they contribute into the GST pool. Every state, be it Western Australia or New South Wales or Tasmania. That is a good, sound principle for what is the state's tax. Now, when it comes to what's happened in New South Wales, because of a corruption investigation that ended the career of a New South Wales Premier, the new Premier is saying that somehow Western Australia should have to pay billions of dollars to New South Wales.
No, we're asking for fairness and equity in the federation. We're asking for WA to pay their way.
An agreement that they made 3 years ago.
This might come as a massive shock for those of you locked in Western Australia. Pay your fair share. That's what we're asking for in New South Wales at the moment. And by the way, Patrick, you've just demonstrated everything that is wrong with the New South Wales ICAC. You are able to say, by imputation, that Gladys Berejiklian is guilty of corruption simply because she has been investigated before a single piece of evidence has been presented to the public or to anyone else.
Let me finish on
Jason,
this.
If the Liberal
Patrick, very briefly on this. Does WA need the money right now compared to the rest of the states?
This is a long-term structural reform to the GST deal that was put in place 3 years ago. It's about, we have an economy that is heavily mining dependent. We know that we go through mining booms and we go through periods where things aren't as rosy in Western Australia. Indeed, Jason's friends in the Liberal Party, when Christian Porter was Treasurer of WA...
But doesn't that work? All the GST, the way it previously worked, is in a boom, you got less of it, right? So
so they want all the upside, Tom, and none of the downside.
Christian Porter racked up $40 billion of debt in his work as WA Treasurer. We're still paying it off here in WA. We've got some problems to fix from the last time Jason's mates were in power here. That's what we're trying to do.
All right. We'll leave it there. Jason, fiery today, but we understand been under pressure for a while. In terms of that lockdown, I'm saying no personal pressure unless there's something I'm missing. But we'll see you next week. Jason maybe with a haircut and having ventured outside of the house. And Patrick, we might talk about how the East doesn't appreciate China enough, because I didn't get to that one today. Gentlemen, speak next week.
See you next week.
See you, Tom. Bye.
Thanks.